August 20, 1942, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The air was thick with humidity and silence. Corporal James Mitchell of the 1st Marine Division knelt beside a shallow trench, his hands dark with coral dust. Somewhere beyond the tree line, engines rumbled, faint, distant, and growing. In the stillness before dawn, the men could smell oil, hear the click of a rifle bolt, and feel the weight of a battle not yet begun. History was waiting in the mud. In the summer of 1942, the war in the Pacific reached a turning point. For the first time, the United States Marines had seized ground from the Japanese Empire. Not by sea, but by land. That patch of earth was called Henderson Field, a half-finished airstrip carved out of jungle and coral by Japanese labor, and captured by the Americans almost by accident. It was not much to look at, just a strip of dirt, ringed by coconut palms and wreckage. But in that war, airfields meant life. Whoever held Henderson could command the skies between the Solomons and Australia. The 1st Marine Division was tired. They had landed with little food, little ammunition, and almost no promise of reinforcements. Each man carried what he could: rifles, grenades, and the quiet knowledge that the Japanese would return. Corporal James Mitchell was 23 years old. Before the war, he had worked as a machinist in Illinois, the kind of man who understood the feel of steel, the weight of a good tool, and the value of something that worked. Now he crouched behind a sandbag wall, cradling his M1 Garand, the rifle that had already earned its reputation as the backbone of the American infantry. But in the jungles of Guadalcanal, even good machines struggled. The air was thick with rot, salt clung to every bolt, weapons jammed, men sweated through their uniforms. And every night, as the sun fell behind the palms, the Marines waited for the next attack. When dawn broke, it came not with silence, but with sound. The shriek of shells, the chatter of machine guns, and the thud of mortars striking coral. By mid-morning, the airstrip was a storm of dirt and smoke. And somewhere within that storm, Corporal Mitchell found himself face to face with the enemy. He did not remember the man's face, only the shadow that moved through the smoke, the flash of bayonet steel, and the single shot that ended it. When it was over, he crouched beside the fallen soldier, a young Japanese corporal, maybe his own age, dressed in a tattered field uniform. Beside the body lay a weapon Mitchell had never seen before. It was short, compact, and strangely elegant, a Type 100 submachine gun, one of Japan's few attempts to match the firepower of the subguns carried by American and British troops. Mitchell turned it over in his hands, studying the lines, the machining, the careful assembly. Even in the grime of war, it looked well made. He wiped the dust from its receiver and read the small marks stamped into the steel. The bolt slid smoothly. The magazine locked with a satisfying click. It was a weapon built by men who understood steel and believed they were building the future. For a moment, the Marine and the machine shared the same silence. Then, the sound of distant gunfire broke it, a reminder that beauty and purpose are never the same thing in war. Mitchell would carry that moment with him long after the battle. The day he met the Type 100 was the day he began to understand what war does to craftsmanship, how every tool of precision eventually becomes a tool of destruction. And in that realization, the silence before the storm was broken. In the end, every war begins with men believing they understand what they are building, and ends with them realizing what it costs. August 21st, 1942. The Battle of the Tenarue River. The jungle was alive with noise, insects, rain, the dull thud of artillery shells landing miles away. Before dawn, the Japanese came screaming through the darkness, bayonets fixed, voices rising in unison. By sunrise, the ground near Henderson Field was slick with mud and blood. For Corporal James Mitchell, this was no longer a defense. It was survival. At Tarawa, the Marines met the full weight of the Japanese counterattack. Wave after wave came across the sandbar, each line swallowed by machine gun fire, replaced by the next. They came with courage, yes, but also with certainty. They had been told the Marines were weak, untrained, exhausted. The Imperial Army had never known defeat on land. But Henderson was not a place for illusions. By mid-morning, the river ran red, and the jungle hummed with death. For hours, the men of the 1st Marine Division fought from foxholes that filled with water and blood. And somewhere among them, Mitchell reloaded his Garand again and again. The 8-round clips snapping into place, with that sharp, mechanical ring that Marines came to love like a heartbeat. In those moments, reliability was more than comfort. It was life. The Garand's semi-automatic rhythm gave the Marines an advantage they could feel with every shot. While the enemy fired bolt-action rifles, 1 bullet at a time, the Garand answered with 8. Steady, precise, unrelenting. But in the chaos, Mitchell's eyes kept returning to the Type 100 submachine gun lying in the sand near his dugout. He had brought it back from the line that morning, not as a trophy, but as a question. What if this weapon, compact, automatic, designed for close combat, could have changed the tide in another kind of fight? When the Japanese closed to within 20 yards, he found out. Mitchell lifted the Type 100, chambered a round, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon spat 20 rounds in a burst, the recoil light, the noise sharp and strange. For a moment, it worked perfectly, a clean sweep of fire through the undergrowth. Then silence. The bolt jammed halfway back. The magazine slipped loose. A fine film of mud and coral grit had already found its way inside. Mitchell cursed, tossed the gun aside, and reached for his Garand. When he pulled the trigger again, it answered him like an old friend. That was the breaking point. The moment the romance of innovation gave way to the reality of endurance. War had a way of testing ideas faster than any engineer could imagine. The Type 100 was clever, yes, but cleverness did not win the night. Dependability did. By evening, the riverbank was silent again. The Japanese attack had failed completely. Hundreds lay dead or dying in the shallows, their bayonets still fixed, their courage undiminished, but undone by firepower they had underestimated. Mitchell sat by the sandbags, breathing through exhaustion, his rifle across his knees. The Type 100 lay beside him, useless now, its barrel caked in sand. He studied it for a long time, not with contempt, but with a kind of respect. He understood what its maker had intended. He just knew it had not survived the truth of the jungle. In the end, it wasn't the better weapon that won at Tenaru. It was the one that refused to fail. Every battle tests more than men. It tests what men believe their machines can do and what they cannot. September 12, 1942, Henderson Field. Night. Rain fell in steady sheets across the mud. Engines coughed in the distance as Japanese bombers droned overhead. Each explosion sent fragments of coral slicing through tents and steel drums. The men called it Hell's Half Acre. To Corporal James Mitchell, it was just another night trying to keep his rifle dry and his nerves steady. By September, Henderson Field had become the center of the world. A patch of earth the size of a farmyard, fought over like sacred ground. The Japanese shelled it every night. They attacked by air at dawn, by sea at dusk, and by infantry whenever darkness gave them courage. The Marines dug deeper, slept less, and learned to live in the rhythm of fire. The airstrip was lined with wrecks, burned-out Wildcats, shattered Zeros, twisted drums of aviation fuel, and yet the field still worked. Every morning, Marine engineers filled bomb craters, refueled planes, and pushed them back into the air. Each takeoff was a small act of defiance, a promise that the island still held. Mitchell spent most days on perimeter duty, moving between foxholes and trenches. He cleaned his Garand twice a day, wiped it dry with rags cut from his uniform. He carried extra clips, a few grenades, and a quiet sense that time was running short. The Japanese were closing in. The line could not hold forever. But war has a way of stripping away belief until only instinct remains. And when the next attack came, a sudden rush through the jungle on September 13th, the Marines fought not for victory, but for breath. The Japanese came in shouting, their officers leading from the front. It was a bayonet charge, pure and terrible. Men screaming, "Banzai!" as they ran into the line of machine gun fire. The Marines answered with rifles, mortars, and the sharp mechanical rhythm of the Garand. Each shot echoed across the coconut grove like a hammer against steel. The field was lit by muzzle flashes and burning palms. Mitchell remembered the Type 100 again. He had brought it with him, curious, half as a backup, half as a reminder. When the enemy broke through the wire, he used it. For 30 seconds, the gun roared, quick, light, deadly in close quarters. Then the magazine emptied. Reloading was slow. The weapon jammed again. By dawn, the attack had broken against the Marines' line like a wave against rock. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay scattered across the clearing. The air reeked of oil, blood, and wet earth. And in that silence, Mitchell realized something he could never quite forget. That war was not about the strongest weapon, or even the bravest soldier. It was about who could keep fighting when everything else failed. The Type 100 had been built with precision. The M1 Garand had been built with purpose. One was elegant, the other inevitable. And as the sun rose over the shattered palms, Corporal James Mitchell sat in the mud and cleaned his Garand again. Not out of habit, but reverence. In the crucible of war, invention meets reality, and only what endures under fire earns the right to be remembered. October 13th, 1942, Guadalcanal. The night sky glowed red as Japanese. Shells tore across Henderson Field. The men would later call it the night of the battleships. 2 enemy warships, Congo and Haruna, crept from the sea and opened fire. For 3 hours the island trembled, the jungle shredded by high explosive shells, the air thick with smoke and burning palm oil. Even the earth seemed to breathe fire. For the Marines, it was the longest night of the campaign. They crouched in trenches or flattened themselves into the mud, listening to the shriek of metal and the endless rhythmic pounding from offshore. Each shell landed closer, until the ground itself heaved like a living thing. Fuel dumps went up in towers of flame. The airstrip vanished beneath clouds of black dust. Men prayed, cursed, or stayed silent, waiting for the next shell that might never come. When dawn broke, the light revealed a landscape that barely looked human. Hangars were gone. Aircraft lay twisted in shallow craters. The communications hut had taken a direct hit. The field surgeon's tent had collapsed under debris. The men of the 1st Marine Division stumbled out of the trenches, dazed, faces streaked with soot and coral dust. Some wept quietly, some laughed, unable to stop. Henderson Field still existed, but only barely. Food was running out. Rations had been cut again. Half a can of beans, a spoonful of rice. The men called themselves the Cactus Air Force and the Starvation Marines. They joked about it because the truth was unbearable. Every morning, the same smell hung over the camp. Rot, sweat, cordite, malaria medicine, and fear. Mitchell's platoon was down to 15 men. They had once been 40. He spent his nights cleaning rifles, counting rounds, listening to the sound of mosquitoes and distant gunfire. Every weapon mattered now. Every spring, every cartridge, every magazine that hadn't rusted shut. The Type 100s were appearing more often among the dead. Mitchell studied them as he moved through the wreckage, not as trophies, but as artifacts. Each one told a story of effort and exhaustion. Some were beautifully machined with finely milled receivers and polished bolts. Others were crude, pitted, hastily welded, the mark of factories straining beneath Allied bombers. The Japanese had built them with the same conviction the Americans built their Garands, that technology could make the difference between defeat and survival. But on this island, machines rusted faster than hope. The rain came harder as October wore on. It turned foxholes into ponds. Ammo belts swelled with moisture. Weapons needed to be cleaned twice a day, sometimes 3 times, just to fire a single magazine. Mitchell had begun to think of his rifle as a living thing, something that needed care, something that returned it. One night, after a heavy bombardment, Mitchell sat with Sergeant Donnelly, a thin man from Boston who had survived every assault so far. The two shared a cigarette under a sheet of tin. Donnelly lifted a captured Type 100 from beside him, wiping the mud from its barrel. "Hell of a gun," he said, turning it in his hands. "Looks nice enough to hang on a wall somewhere." Mitchell smiled faintly. "It's a good gun in a bad place," Donnelly nodded. "Ain't that the truth? Everything's in the wrong place on this island." They sat in silence, listening to the surf and the distant drone of aircraft. A few hours later, the next Japanese attack came, sudden, close, and brutal. Bayonets in the dark, flashes of grenades. The perimeter shook as the Marines fired blind into the trees. Mitchell fought until his rifle ran dry, then switched to the Type 100 Donnelly had left behind. He fired a short burst, 20 rounds, before it jammed solid. When he cleared it, Donnelly was gone. At dawn, the field was littered with bodies. The jungle stank of smoke and rain. Mitchell found Donnelly lying near the trench line, helmet half buried, one hand still clutching a spent magazine. Beside him lay the Type 100, its bolt locked halfway back, mud caked deep in its receiver. Mitchell knelt there a long time, neither speaking nor moving. When the stretcher-bearers came, he buried the gun beside Donnelly's grave, a small patch of cleared soil marked with driftwood, and a dog tag tied in wire. He told no one. For him, the weapon had become something symbolic. Not a tool, but a memory of all the men who had believed too deeply in steel. That week, the monsoon arrived in full force. The airfield flooded. Supplies rotted in their crates. Planes that could still fly had to be pushed down the runway by hand, their engines coughing water and smoke. Some of the wounded were evacuated by night, their stretchers carried through waist-high mud to waiting boats. Most stayed. The Japanese naval bombardments continued. Each night, the horizon flickered orange. Each day, fewer Marines answered roll call, yet the line never broke. Through disease, hunger, and exhaustion, Henderson Field held not through brilliance, but through stubbornness. By November, reinforcements finally began to arrive. Fresh troops, clean uniforms, new supplies. The old Marines watched them unload from landing craft with disbelief, as if watching ghosts replace the living. The battle for Guadalcanal would continue, but for Mitchell and the others, their part of it was already finished. They had endured the fall and somehow remained standing. In the weeks that followed, Mitchell kept a small notebook, details of weapons, ammunition, and what he'd learned. Next to the entry for Type 100 SMG, he wrote one line, "Built for a war that moved faster than it could." He never spoke of it again. The island slowly quieted. The jungle began to reclaim the wreckage. Vines wrapping around gun barrels, palm roots splitting open shell casings. What had once been the heart of war became a graveyard of machines. The Type 100s, the Garands, the helmets, the rusting aircraft, all slowly sinking back into the earth that had outlasted them. By the time Mitchell left Guadalcanal, he was thinner, older, and silent. He carried his rifle home, cleaned and oiled, but he never fired it again. In his mind, the sound of that weapon had become inseparable from the men who hadn't returned. The Type 100s, meanwhile, vanished into history, melted down, buried, or lost at sea. What few remained found their way to museums, relics of a war that had devoured its own inventions. When the ground gives way and the guns fall silent, what remains isn't victory. It's what the survivors remember. December 1942, Guadalcanal. The guns had fallen silent. The nights were long now, filled with the crackle of insects, the whisper of the surf, and the distant hum of engines somewhere far out to sea. Corporal James Mitchell sat alone by the wreckage of a fuel drum, smoking the last cigarette from his ration tin. He was alive, but the world around him was gone. The jungle had reclaimed what the war had taken. Victory, when it came, did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The Marines of the 1st Division had survived months of siege, disease, and starvation. Now they were being replaced, lifted out by ship, one skeletal body at a time. Their replacements stared at them with quiet awe, not realizing that the men they admired were half-broken. Mitchell boarded a landing craft in the rain. He carried nothing but his rifle, a few letters, and a photograph that had survived the monsoon. The ship that took him away from Guadalcanal smelled of salt and disinfectant. The hammocks were full of coughing men, their eyes sunken, their uniforms hanging loose. The medics said they had won, but no one on that deck looked victorious. When the island finally disappeared behind the mist, Mitchell felt only a strange emptiness. He had survived the most desperate months of the Pacific campaign, yet survival itself felt uncertain, as if something inside him had stayed behind in the coral and mud. They sent the division to Australia to recover. Fresh uniforms, real food, clean beds. The first shower he took was almost painful. Water on skin felt unnatural after months of grime. Some of the men slept for 2 days straight. Others couldn't sleep at all, their minds still trapped in the rhythm of shellfire. Mitchell found himself drawn to silence. He began working in the armory, inspecting weapons, repairing what could be repaired. It was the only place that felt familiar. The smell of oil, the sound of steel on steel, the click of a bolt sliding home. All of it reminded him of something that had once made sense. Sometimes he would find a captured weapon in the storage crates. Japanese Arisaka rifles, Nambu pistols, and a few Type 100 submachine guns shipped back for study. He would pick one up and feel the weight of memory. The balance was perfect, the design efficient, but the metal still smelled faintly of salt. Even in the controlled quiet of the workshop, the gun seemed haunted, a relic from a night that refused to end. One day, a Navy ordnance officer came through inspecting the captured equipment. He paused when he saw Mitchell holding one of the Type 100s. "Hell of a piece, isn't it?" he said. "Yeah," Mitchell replied quietly. "Hell of a piece." The officer smiled. "We'll learn from it. That's the thing about war. Even the enemy teaches you something." Mitchell nodded, though he wasn't sure if that was true. The only lesson he had learned was that every machine, no matter how advanced, eventually breaks. And every man, no matter how brave, does too. Outside the barracks, news from the front poured in. Tarawa, Bougainville, New Georgia. The war rolled forward, island by island, as if the sacrifice at Guadalcanal had simply been the first step in an endless climb. The newspapers called it a turning point, the beginning of the end. But for the men who had been there, it felt like something more complicated. They had turned the tide, yes, but the tide kept coming back. At night, Mitchell would walk past the rows of rifles stacked neatly in racks. He would stop by his Garand, run a cloth over the stock, and think about how many times that weapon had answered him when nothing else would. It had become a part of him, a symbol of endurance, not victory. He knew that somewhere, in some other armory, the Japanese had done the same with their own tools, each man tending to the steel that had once been his salvation. He wondered whether they, too, felt that strange silence after battle, the sound of a weapon that no longer needed to speak. Months passed. The division was declared ready for combat again. New men filled the ranks. The old ones were scattered to training camps or hospitals. Mitchell stayed behind for a time, helping test new equipment, new radios, new rifles. He understood the mechanics, but something in him resisted the idea of progress. Each new weapon promised to make war cleaner, faster, more efficient. He knew better. He had seen what efficiency looked like under fire. Men fighting to keep one weapon working while everything around them fell apart. War, he thought, was not improved by design. It was only extended by it. Sometimes he dreamed of Guadalcanal. He could still smell the smoke. He could still see Donnelly's face, laughing in the dark before the shelling started. In the dream, the jungle was quiet again, but the silence was heavy. The kind of silence that follows a scream. When his unit finally shipped out again, Mitchell volunteered to stay with the Ordnance Corps. He had had enough of the front. He spent the rest of the war repairing weapons, training recruits, cataloging the designs the enemy left behind. The Type 100 appeared often in the manuals. Neat diagrams, measurements, rate of fire, muzzle velocity, all the details, but none of the truth. He would sometimes pause over its illustration and remember the night he buried one beside a friend. To the engineers, it was just a specification. To him, it was a ghost. By 1945, when the war finally ended, the Type 100 was already forgotten. A curiosity in museums, a footnote in ordnance reports. But to the men who had seen it up close, it remained a reminder of something deeper. The strange intersection between craftsmanship and consequence. Mitchell returned home carrying the same Garand he had brought to Guadalcanal. He hung it on the wall of his father's workshop and never touched it again. He went back to machining, to building instead of breaking. Sometimes, when the noise of the lathe matched the old rhythm of battle, he would stop, close his eyes, and listen. In those moments, the long night never truly ended. It just grew quieter. War ends on paper long before it ends in the mind. For the men who survive it, the silence is never empty. It just changes its sound. Spring 1947, Chicago, Illinois. In a small factory on the city's south side, machines hummed again. But not for war. Corporal James Mitchell, now a civilian, stood beside a lathe polishing the edge of a steel component. The smell of oil and metal was the same as it had been in Guadalcanal, yet the sound was gentler, almost human. He had traded bullets for bolts, rifles for rivets, but every spark that fell from the lathe reminded him where it had all begun. 2 years after the war, America was rebuilding, factories retooled, veterans returning to school or work, the country humming with the promise of peace. Yet beneath the surface there lingered a question that no victory parade could answer. What had it all been for? The newspapers spoke of a new world, a modern age, born from the fires of global war. But for men like Mitchell, the war had never truly ended. It lived quietly in the hands, in the rhythm of work, in the way he flinched at sudden noise. He never called it trauma. He just said the world was too loud now. Sometimes he would visit the museum downtown, the one that displayed captured weapons behind glass. In a dimly lit corner, he found one he recognized instantly, the Type 100 submachine gun. The plaque beneath it read, Japanese Type 100, introduced 1942, limited production. Captured on Guadalcanal, no story, no names, just steel and silence. Mitchell stood there for a long time, staring at the weapon through the glass. It was cleaner than he remembered. Polished, preserved, empty. He could almost see his reflection in the receiver. He wondered how many hands had held it before it ended up here. How many had died with it? How many had lived because of it? The years after the war brought declassification, reports, statistics, ordnance evaluations. The government released its findings on the weapons of the Pacific Theater. The Type 100 was described as well-machined but over-engineered. It fired too slowly. It jammed easily under field conditions. It was never mass-produced in sufficient numbers to matter. The conclusion was simple: ineffective compared to U.S. small arms. The paper was clinical, precise, written by men who had never held one under fire. Mitchell kept a copy of that report for years, not because he disagreed, but because he understood what those words cost. He remembered how, on that island, every weapon was more than a statistic. Each piece of steel carried the fingerprints of the men who had built it, the machinists, the draftsmen, the workers who believed their craft could shape history. He thought about the Japanese engineer who had cut the grooves in the barrel, who had checked the tolerances, who had done his work with the same quiet pride Mitchell once felt at his own machine bench. Somewhere across the ocean, that man had probably asked himself the same question. Was it worth it? By 1950, a new war was beginning in Korea. Old weapons were cleaned and shipped off again. Among the crates were relics from Guadalcanal, Garands, Thompsons, Springfields, and even a few captured Type 100s. The machines of the last war were being recycled for the next. Mitchell read about it in the papers and felt something sink inside him. He had once believed that progress would mean peace, that men would learn from what they had seen. But the world seemed determined to forget faster than it could rebuild. He began keeping a journal, not for others, but for himself. In it, he wrote about the things he remembered most clearly. The smell of the airstrip after a rainstorm, the sound of the Garand's clip ejecting, the way the Type 100 jammed just when he needed it most, and the faces, men who lived for one more hour, one more night, one more breath. Each page was an act of reckoning, a way to make sense of something that refused to be understood. In 1953, a letter arrived from the Marine Corps Historical Division. They were gathering testimonies from veterans of Guadalcanal for a formal archive. Mitchell hesitated. Then, one night, he sat at his kitchen table, turned on a small lamp, and began to write. He wrote not about glory or victory or heroism, but about the machinery of war and how it consumed the people who built it. He described the Type 100 in detail, its weight, its balance, its flaws. He wrote about Sergeant Donnelly and how the gun had failed him when it mattered most. And he ended with a single line, "We build to protect, but in war, what we build only learns to destroy us faster." When he finished, he folded the pages, sealed them in an envelope, and never spoke of it again. A few months later, he received a short note of thanks, and nothing more. His testimony joined thousands of others, stacked in archives, filed by serial number, waiting for historians who might someday care. Time moved on. The world changed. New wars, new weapons, new names. The old designs were forgotten. The Garand gave way to the M14, then the M16. The Type 100 was little more than a footnote, an image in a textbook. But sometimes, late at night, when the factory was quiet and the machines were still, Mitchell would think about that island again. He would picture the mud, the rain, the flicker of firelight on steel. He would remember how fragile even the strongest machine could be, and how men, somehow, were stronger still. He never stopped building. He just never stopped remembering. The reckoning of war doesn't happen on the battlefield. It happens later, in the silence, when men finally have to live with what they made. August 7th, 1972, Quantico, Virginia. The Marine Corps Museum opened its new Pacific War exhibit that summer. Among the displays stood a glass case marked simply, "Captured Japanese Weapons, Guadalcanal, 1942. Inside it, under bright white light, rested a single rifle, a corroded helmet, and one Type 100 submachine gun. Most visitors walked past without stopping, but one older man lingered, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes fixed not on the gun, but on the reflection staring back at him. 30 years had passed since Henderson Field. The jungles of Guadalcanal were quiet now, overgrown, peaceful, indifferent to what had happened there. Tourists came to see the relics, rusting tanks half buried in the soil, old bullets washed up on the beach. Nature had done what history could not. It had forgotten. But for those who had fought there, forgetting was never possible. Time dulled the noise, but not the weight. For Mitchell, now 73, the war was less a memory than a presence, something that followed him in the small hours, as constant as his own breathing. He stood before that Type 100 for nearly 10 minutes. He had seen hundreds like it. But this one looked familiar. The curve of the stock, the worn serial number faintly visible near the receiver. Maybe it was the same gun. Maybe not. It didn't matter. They all told the same story. A story of men who built something they believed would save them, and discovered it could not even save itself. Outside the museum, flags fluttered in the summer wind. Children ran between exhibits, laughing, pointing at the aircraft, the tanks, the rows of medals. To them, it was history. Clean, contained, safe behind glass. But war, Mitchell thought, was never safe. It only looked that way when sealed away in silence. He watched one young boy press his hand against the glass near the Type 100. The boy's reflection merged with his own. Two faces separated by a lifetime of invention and ruin. Mitchell felt a quiet ache then. Not sorrow, exactly, but recognition. Every generation inherits the machines of the one before it, and every generation must decide what to do with them. In his final years, Mitchell continued to write, not about battle, but about the people who built the weapons of war. He wrote of the Japanese engineers in Nagoya who forged the first Type 100s under Allied bombing raids, their factories shaking as they worked. He wrote of the American machinists in Springfield and Hartford, who turned out Garands and Thompsons by the thousands, never knowing where their work would end up. He wrote about the strange fraternity that existed among builders, men separated by oceans, united by steel. To him, history was not divided by sides, but by purpose. Some men built to survive, some built to conquer, and some, like him, built because they believed that a well-made tool was proof that humanity could create order from chaos. But the war had taught him otherwise. In the end, the machines always outlasted the men, and they always waited to be used again. One autumn afternoon, Mitchell's granddaughter asked him why he never spoke of the war. He thought for a long time before answering. "I don't know if it's something you talk about," he said. "It's something you carry. Some of it was terrible. Some of it was beautiful. But none of it ever really leaves you." He paused, then added softly, "We thought we were building peace. Maybe we were just building time." She didn't understand then. But years later, when she visited the museum after his passing, she stopped before the same Type 100 display. The plaque had been updated. It now included a line from one of Mitchell's letters, sent to the Marine Corps archive decades earlier. "A weapon is only as honest as the hands that hold it, and every weapon remembers the man who built it." Today, the Type 100 is nearly forgotten. Only a handful survive. A few in museums, a few in private collections. Historians agree it was an elegant failure, a weapon too late and too few to matter. Yet its story endures because it mirrors the truth of war itself. That innovation and tragedy often share the same forge. The M1 Garand, by contrast, became a legend, the rifle that won a world war. But even it, too, has been replaced, its steel now cold and ceremonial. The world keeps inventing, keeps refining, keeps repeating. Every new generation of weapon is built from the lessons of the last, and from the silence of the men who tried to forget. In the end, the legacy of Henderson Field was not victory. It was endurance. A handful of men on a strip of coral proved that reliability could outlast genius, and that courage, quiet, unremarkable courage, could turn the course of history. And somewhere, in a glass case in Quantico, that truth still lingers in the sheen of a forgotten gun, resting behind its reflection of light and time. War doesn't vanish. It changes its shape and waits to be rediscovered.